Some of the most famous medieval torture devices may not have been medieval at all. The Iron Maiden, the Judas Cradle, the Pear of Anguish. They appear in museums, books, and online lists as if they were everyday tools of medieval cruelty. But when you look closer, the story becomes more complicated. Some devices were real, some were exaggerated, some were used more in the late medieval or early modern period, and some were probably made famous by later legends, museum displays, and the modern desire to imagine the Middle Ages as darker than they already were. That does not mean medieval punishment was gentle. It was not. The real medieval world had chains, racks, public shame, mutilation, burning, prisons, and executions. It did not need every legend to be true to be terrifying. So the question is not just which torture device was the worst. The real question is this: what was real, what was myth, and why did people fear these punishments so much? Medieval torture was not the same everywhere. The Middle Ages lasted for centuries, and different kingdoms, towns, courts, and rulers used different laws. A punishment that appeared in one place might be rare somewhere else. A device people call medieval may actually belong more to a later period, so we have to separate history from legend. And we begin with something very real: the stocks and the pillory. These were real forms of public punishment. The stocks usually locked a person's ankles. The pillory usually locked the head and hands into a wooden frame. The prisoner was placed in a public space, often a market square, street, or town center. At first, this may not look as terrifying as a rack or a spiked cabinet. There were no blades, no wheels, and no iron spikes. But the danger was the crowd. A person in the pillory could not hide their face. They could not run. They could not defend themselves properly. Neighbors could mock them. Enemies could insult them. People might throw rotten food, mud, waste, or stones. Sometimes the crowd could injure the prisoner badly. The authority created the punishment, but the public helped carry it out. That is what made the pillory so powerful. It was not only pain, it was shame. In a medieval town, reputation mattered. Your name, work, family, and trust could decide whether you survived. A person might leave the pillory alive but lose their standing in the community. This was real medieval punishment, not hidden in a dungeon, not always bloody, but public, humiliating, and designed to turn a person into a warning. But not every punishment needed a crowd. The next one used the body's own weight against itself, the strappato. This was real, though it became especially known in late medieval and early modern Europe. The method was simple. The prisoner's hands were tied behind their back. A rope was attached to their wrists. Then the rope was pulled upward until the prisoner was lifted off the ground. Because the arms were tied behind the back, the weight of the body pulled against the shoulders in an unnatural direction. The shoulders could dislocate, joints could tear, nerves could be damaged. Sometimes weights were added. Sometimes the prisoner was dropped suddenly and caught by the rope, making the injury worse. The strappato did not need blades or blood. It turned gravity into torture. It was often connected with interrogation. A question was asked. The prisoner refused. The rope tightened. The body rose. Then the question came again. This shows one of the darkest problems with torture. Pain could force speech, but speech under torture was not always truth. A prisoner might confess to something they did not do. They might give false names. They might say whatever would make the pain stop. The strappato was real, but the truth it produced could be dangerously unreliable. That same problem appears again with one of the most famous torture devices in history, the rack. The rack was real. It was a wooden frame where the prisoner was tied by the wrists and ankles. Then ropes, rollers, or turning mechanisms were tightened. Slowly, the body was stretched. The rack did not have to cut the prisoner to cause terrible damage. It pulled the limbs away from the body. The shoulders, elbows, hips, knees, and spine were placed under extreme strain. Joints could dislocate, muscles could tear. The prisoner might be permanently injured. But the rack was not only a machine of pain, it was a machine of anticipation. The prisoner could see the frame, they could hear the rope tightening. They could feel the pressure increase little by little. Every turn meant the next level of suffering. Sometimes the threat of the rack may have been enough. A prisoner who saw it might speak before the torture even began. The rack made fear visible. It turned the question into a choice: answer or the next turn comes. But if a confession is pulled from a body under torture, how much is it worth? A guilty person might confess. An innocent person might also confess. That is why the rack matters. It shows the danger of treating pain like proof. The next device was much smaller, but small did not mean merciful. Thumbscrews were real, though they are often associated more strongly with later medieval and early modern interrogation. The device was usually metal. A prisoner's thumb or finger was placed between two plates, then a screw was turned. The pressure increased slowly. Bones could crack, nails could split, skin could tear. The pain was focused and precise. Thumbscrews attacked the hands, and in the medieval world, hands meant survival. Hands worked fields, held tools, carried water, made bread, wrote documents, built, repaired, cooked, and fought. A damaged hand could threaten a person's future work. For a laborer, broken fingers could mean lost income. For a craftsman, lost skill. For a scribe, lost livelihood. So thumbscrews were not only about pain in the moment, they threatened the life that came after. Some punishments did not end when the device was removed. They followed the person home. And sometimes the device was not really a device at all. Sometimes the prison itself became the torture. Chains, shackles, and irons were real. They were tools of restraint, but restraint could become torture when combined with time, darkness, hunger, cold, and neglect. A prisoner could be chained to a wall, locked in heavy irons, forced to sit or stand in painful positions, left in damp rooms, left in darkness, left with little food, left in filth. At first, chains may sound ordinary, but imagine wearing them for days, then weeks. Metal rubs the skin, wrists swell, ankles bleed, sores open, the body stiffens. Sleep becomes difficult. The prisoner cannot stretch, clean themselves, or move away from waste. A small wound can become infected. A locked door, a chain. And time could break a person without any legendary machine. For many prisoners, this may have been more real than any famous torture myth. The next punishment was real, public, and meant to be remembered: whipping. A prisoner could be tied to a post, stripped to expose the back, and beaten with a whip, rod, or lash. The pain was obvious, but the public nature mattered just as much. The crowd could see the punishment. They could hear the strikes. They could watch the body react. Whipping made pain visible. It turned the punished person into a warning. It could leave cuts, bruises, scars, and long-term injury. And because medical care was limited, wounds could become dangerous. A whipping might not be intended as an execution, but infection, fever, or blood loss could still kill. The marks also mattered. A person could carry the punishment on their skin. Punishment became memory written on the body. That leads to another punishment designed to last: branding. Branding was real. A piece of metal was heated until it could burn the skin. Then it was pressed into the body, leaving a permanent mark. The pain was immediate, but the deeper punishment came afterward. A brand could identify someone as a criminal or offender. In a society where reputation could decide work, trust, marriage, and belonging, a visible mark could ruin a future. A branded person might be recognized, rejected, suspected, avoided. The wound could heal, but the meaning remained. Branding turned punishment into identity. The body carried the record. Some punishments followed someone for life. That was even more true with mutilation. Mutilation was real, though practices varied by place, law, crime, and period. Mutilation means permanently damaging or removing part of the body: a hand, an ear, a nose, the eyes. Sometimes it was criminal punishment, sometimes it was political. A thief might be punished through the hand because the hand was connected to the crime. A person's face might be damaged to create permanent shame. A political rival might be blinded because blindness could make someone appear unfit to rule. Mutilation was not only about pain, it changed a person's place in society. A missing hand could make work harder, a damaged face could make shame visible. Blindness could remove power. The body became the record of punishment. The person survived, but survived as someone permanently changed. Now we come to one of the most brutal punishments associated with medieval and early modern Europe: the breaking wheel. This was real, and the name was literal. It broke bones. The condemned person could be tied to a wheel, frame, or platform. Then the executioner used a heavy club, bar, or hammer-like tool to break the limbs, the arms, the legs, the joints. Afterward, the body could be woven through the spokes of a wheel or displayed on it. In some cases, the breaking itself was the execution. In others, the person might be left to die after the bones were broken. The breaking wheel was not only about killing, it was about spectacle. The crowd saw the result. The wheel lifted the broken body into public memory. So when people say someone was broken on the wheel, they do not mean emotionally broken. They mean physically broken, bone by bone, in front of witnesses. This was punishment as theater. But not every terrifying device in the modern imagination is this well supported. This is where medieval history starts turning into museum myth. The most famous device may also be one of the least real, the Iron Maiden. Most people imagine it as a tall, human-shaped iron cabinet. Inside are spikes. A prisoner is placed inside, the door closes, the spikes pierce the body. That is the popular image. But was it a real medieval torture device? The safest answer is no, not in the way people usually imagine. The Iron Maiden is widely considered mostly myth, or at least a later invention or sensational object rather than a proven medieval torture device. Its fame grew through later displays, legends, and torture museums. It looks medieval, it feels medieval, but the evidence for common medieval use is weak. So what did it supposedly do? According to the legend, it trapped a prisoner inside a spiked cabinet and pierced them when the door closed. But history is not the same as a scary display. The Middle Ages were brutal enough without it. The rack was real, mutilation was real, public punishment was real, burning was real. The Iron Maiden is more useful as a myth about medieval cruelty than as a reliable example of medieval justice. Another famous device falls into a similar category, the Judas cradle. This one is debated. It is often described as a pointed pyramid-shaped seat or wooden spike. A prisoner would be suspended above it. Then their body would be lowered onto the point. Their own weight would create pain and injury. That is what it was supposed to do. But was it a common medieval device? The evidence is uncertain. Like the Iron Maiden, the Judas cradle appears often in torture museums and modern lists, but it should not be presented as clearly proven or widely used in medieval justice. It may be misdated, it may be exaggerated, it may belong more to later torture mythology, but the fear it represents is real. Suspension was real, forced positions were real, humiliation was real, pain created by body weight was real in different forms. So the name device is debated, the broader idea is believable, that distinction matters. The same caution applies to the pair of anguish. The pair of anguish is usually described as a pear-shaped metal instrument. The story says it could be inserted into the mouth or body, then a screw would expand it. That is the legend. It sounds horrifying. But its medieval history is highly questionable. Many examples appear to come from later periods. Some may have been misunderstood objects, later inventions, or museum curiosities. There is weak evidence that it was a common medieval torture device, so it is best treated as highly questionable, likely exaggerated, and not standard medieval fact. This is why torture history becomes confusing. Real punishments and doubtful devices are often placed side by side. A rack, which was real, appears next to an Iron Maiden, which is likely myth. A pillory, which was common, appears next to the pair of anguish, which is doubtful. The viewer may think everything was equally real. It was not. Now we return to something very real. Fire. Fire was used in punishment in several ways. Branding used heated iron. Hot irons could be used as threats or punishments. And burning at the stake became one of the most feared forms of execution, especially in cases involving heresy and religious authority. Fire was terrifying because it was physical, symbolic, and public. It did not only hurt or kill, it sent a message. The condemned person was placed before the community. The wood was prepared, the flames rose, the crowd watched. In religious contexts, fire could be connected to purification, judgment, and the destruction of corruption. For the condemned, it was one of the most feared deaths imaginable. For the crowd, it was unforgettable. Smoke, heat, prayer, authority, a body becoming a warning. Fire did not need gears or spikes. It was simple, visible, and terrifying. Some punishments were not about hidden chambers. They were about making sure everyone saw. That is also why cages mattered. Cages were real forms of confinement and public display. They were used in different ways across medieval and later European punishment. A person could be locked in a cage and displayed. Some cages were hung from walls, towers, or buildings. In some cases, bodies or remains were displayed after execution as warnings. The purpose was exposure. A cage made someone helpless in public. The prisoner could be seen but could not escape. They could not control who watched them. They could not escape the weather. Cold, rain, heat, wind, hunger, thirst. A cage could punish the living. It could also turn the dead into a warning. It made helplessness visible. But the final place may be the most psychologically haunting, the dungeon and the oubliette. First, the dungeon was real. Medieval castles and fortifications could have prison spaces, tower cells, gatehouse rooms, and underground chambers. Conditions varied. Some noble prisoners held for ransom might be treated better. Others could be held in miserable conditions. But the word oubliette needs careful explanation. An oubliette was a type of prison associated with being forgotten. The word comes from the French idea of forgetting. In popular imagination, it is a deep, narrow cell or pit with an opening at the top. A prisoner might be lowered or dropped inside. The opening would be closed. The prisoner could not climb out. They might be left in darkness with little food, water, or hope. But was every oubliette real? No. This is another partly real, partly exaggerated area. Some castle spaces called oubliettes may have been storage pits, wells, or later misidentified rooms. Not every castle had a secret pit designed for forgotten prisoners, but the fear behind the oubliette was real. The fear was disappearance, not public shame, not execution before a crowd, not branding and release, but being removed from the world. A prisoner in an oubliette might not know the day. They might not see the sun. They might hear footsteps above and never know if anyone was coming. They might wait for food, wait for water, wait for trial, wait for death, wait to be remembered. That is why the idea remains so disturbing. Sometimes the worst torture was not a device, it was abandonment. So what was real and what was myth? The stocks and pillory were real, the strappado was real, the rack was real, thumbscrews were real, though often associated with later medieval and early modern interrogation. Chains, shackles, and irons were real and could become torture through time and conditions. Whipping was real, branding was real, mutilation was real. The breaking wheel was real and it broke bones before or during execution. Fire and hot irons were real, cages and public display were real. The oubliette was partly real, partly exaggerated depending on the claim. The Iron Maiden was most likely mostly myth or later sensationalism. The Judas cradle was debated and not proven as a common medieval device. The pair of anguish was highly questionable as a medieval torture device. That is the truth behind the legend. Some of the most famous objects are the least certain, and some of the simplest punishments were the most real. A wooden frame in a town square, a rope over a beam, a chain on a stone wall, a hot iron, a public cage, a locked cell. These may not look as dramatic as a spiked cabinet, but they belong to a world where punishment was public, unequal, and often brutal. Medieval torture was not terrifying because every legend was true. It was terrifying because the real world already had enough cruelty. Pain could be called justice. Shame could become punishment. A crowd could become part of the sentence. A confession could be pulled from suffering. A body could be marked for life. A prisoner could be displayed or forgotten. The Middle Ages did not need the Iron Maiden to be frightening. They already had the rack, the wheel, the pillory, the brand, the chain, the stake, the dungeon, and the people who had the power to use them. That is why the question matters: what was real and what was myth? Because myth can distract us from the truth, and the truth is dark enough. Some devices were real, some were debated, some were exaggerated, some were mostly myth. But together they reveal what people feared most: not only death, but pain without control, shame without escape, a body marked forever, a crowd watching, a door locked from the outside, and the possibility of being remembered only as a warning. That is the brutal truth behind medieval torture devices. What was real was terrifying. What was myth was revealing. And between the two, we can see how medieval punishment became one of the darkest images in the history of fear.